Thank you, everybody, for joining Rethink Trade. Senator Markey and two of the world's leading digital governance and AI experts, Doctors Kristina Irion and Sarah Myers-West, for what may be an alarming but important tour of a coming collision between the imperative to regulate artificial intelligence, AI, and big tech's efforts to evade, well, regulation and oversight. It's no news to anyone that digital technologies are affecting every aspect of our lives, and automated decision-making, AI, has a growing part of that. And while the administration and Congress are trying to get a grasp on AI threats, and importantly, are trying to get ahead of them, industry interests are stealthily working to make the very policy tools needing to do that illegal trade barriers so that they cannot be deployed. This week, we saw AI firms at the White House praising voluntary AI safety standards, but behind closed doors, the lobby interests representing big tech in Washington are doing their best to lock in what are called digital trade rules that forbid governments from regulating them and forestalling the threats that they could pose to our privacy, our kids' safety, our workplaces, our democracy. The digital trade logo is a very clever brand, but it doesn't have anything to do with trade. It's not about getting your e-commerce products delivered more quickly. Rather, it's a branding job for trying to actually do a form of international preemption, inserting into binding trade agreements rules that limit what signatory governments can do as far as the policy tools and regulatory approaches that they can use. The first target of big tech right now to insert these rules during the Biden administration is the first big negotiation, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That's a 14-country negotiation, which would have binding rules covering 40% of the world economy. These negotiations are very different than past trade pacts. So the big tech firms managed to get into President Trump's NAFTA redo some extreme digital trade rules that don't appear in other agreements, that give big tech companies new rights and powers, and that handcuff governments. There were other things in some of those past agreements before the USMCA that gave corporations a lot of power. The IPEF is not like that. It doesn't have a lot of the rigged rules that caused the job loss and the attack on environmental policies in the past. But there's one target that still remains that is a subject of the IPEF talks, and that is digital trade. It's a whole chapter. Now, the good news is that the Biden administration has an all-of-government competition policy. It has tried to get ahead of AI with its blueprint for a Bill of Rights for AI. It has the record of having the first president give a State of Union address, calling out big tech by name and promising to protect our kids and our privacy. And there is U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai, who is leading the president's new worker-centered trade agenda and has given numerous speeches about how a new approach on digital trade inherently has to be part of that agenda. The bad news is that, as we're going to learn shortly, the tech interests are relentless, and there's a lot of corporate influence in the trade negotiating process, which the IPEF talks are following. You can see online at rethinktrade.org our infographic loaded, showing almost 90% of the official US trade advisors represent corporations. There's also a lot of revolving door action between big tech interests and some of the government agencies involved. So as a result, the members of Congress who are leading on digital governance issues and the Biden administration, the agencies involved in tech oversight, are all very closely watching the IPEF digital trade talks to try and make sure that they actually deliver and are consistent on the rest of the administration's agenda. Our first speaker is going to be Rethink Trade's research director, who's going to walk us through our newest report, which we're releasing today, and you can find in our website, rethinktrade.org. It's called Undermining AI Regulation in the US and Abroad, the Digital Trade Secrecy, Ploy. To boil down the findings, one of the rules that the big tech interests want in these agreements would basically take away the fundamental tools that the president's AI Bill of Rights, that all of the legislation being forwarded on AI oversight would find to be a critical tool for all of these areas of regulation to try and make sure that AI tools are pre-screened to make sure that we do not have biased policing and prosecution, unemployment discrimination, intrusive worker surveillance, unfair lending and housing practices, all of the threats that are inherent in AI and automated decision-making technologies. So with that, to walk us through the details, may I please introduce Daniel Rangel. Daniel is Rethink Trade's research director. He's a trade lawyer, and he's the author of this and other key reports. Again, you can read the details after you listen to Daniel and see his slides on rethinktrade.org. Daniel, please.
Thank you, Lori. And I also want to extend my gratitude to Dr. Sarah West and Dr. Kristina Irion and Senator Markey for joining us today. And particularly for our two speakers for peer reviewing this report to make sure that we got all of these complicated details about AI policy right. So talking about this issue today is probably easier than it would have been a year ago when we started working on this report, because AI is everywhere nowadays. It's a very heated policy discussion. It's even a kitchen table issue that families across the US and also in many other countries around the world discuss. Will, can you put the next slide, please? Thank you. So in that way, it's easier for people to understand how AI systems are actually having an impact on our lives. And people are thinking about ChatGPT and other generative AI tools. But in reality, this goes way beyond this kind of new generation AI tools that are very visible for all of us. Automated decision systems, which are AI tools that basically make decisions for human beings without even human oversight or with very little human input, are already being used to make decisions in a lot of areas that impact all of our lives, starting with hiring and workplace management, whether you get a home loan or if your insurance is going to cover something, at different stages of the criminal justice system and by law enforcement agencies, by companies to determine prices and supply chain management, and also for access to public and private services. The common denominator of all of these systems is that they have three core elements. They have large amounts of data, they have an algorithm or many algorithms or mathematical formulas that process the data, and they have huge computational power that is the infrastructure that is supporting all of this. The algorithm, when it is expressed in a way that humans can understand it, so the code that the programmers are actually writing down and using, that's what people refer to as source code. And keep that in mind because it's going to be very important. Next slide, please. It is true that AI can have many benefits, but the thing is that widespread use of AI has already shown that there are demonstrated harms, and these harms include inaccuracies and biases that disproportionately affect women, people of color, and people with disabilities. Some examples were those that Lori was mentioning, but we could say that, for instance, bias policing is one that is very problematic in the way in which when bad data is being fed into software that police uses to determine which areas they're going to police, then you could end up in a system in which you are always over policing Black and brown communities. There is a very useful report actually from AI Now Institute that explains this issue. Employment discrimination, when a software has variables that are proxy for race or gender, then you may end up with a discriminatory software that is making decisions for management to to choose who they're going to interview or give out a job. In the realm of competition policy, for instance, big tech companies have already been investigated for using algorithms to self-preference their own products, or algorithms have also been used to facilitate collusion between competitors to jack up prices. All of these harms and biases stem either from the data that's being fed into the system or the algorithmic model itself. And the algorithmic model is embedded in the source code. Next slide, please. These harms have generated the calls from researchers and policy experts that have called for algorithmic transparency and accountability, or algorithmic justice. It has many names. The common feature is that they all agree that we need strong documentation requirements, we need mandatory verifiable impact assessment of AI systems, pre-deployment testing, that means that the companies must test those systems before they are released into the public, and third-party audits, particularly for those systems in high-risk sectors, such as education or employment. If we want to implement all of these tools, governments, researchers, and auditors need to have access to key algorithmic information, and that includes the source code of the AI systems. Next slide, please. This is not something that is far out and is already being proposed both in the US and in many other countries. For instance, last year, as Lori mentioned, the White House published the AI Bill of Rights. This is a policy document that recommends pre-deployment testing, risk identification and mitigation, ongoing monitoring, independent evaluations, and algorithmic impact assessments to be included in policy frameworks, both at the federal and at the state level. Actually, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, that federal bill that was discussed last Congress with bipartisan support and is shortly going to be reintroduced this Congress, require impact assessments and algorithmic design evaluations to be submitted to the FTC by certain tech companies. Those assessments will have had detailed descriptions of the algorithms so that the FTC could determine whether the companies were complying with the law or not. In Europe, the AI Act is surely going to be adopted, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the AI Act because we have a European expert in our panel. So how is all of this related to digital trade? The answer is that, as Lori mentioned, corporations have managed to include these source code rules into trade agreements, into digital trade agreements that basically ban governments from requiring access to the source code of a software. But in the USMCA version, the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, even to the algorithm that is expressed in that software, in that source code. If you look at the definition of an algorithm in that deal, is a defined sequence of steps taken to solve a problem to obtain a result. That is super broad. So what we are concerned about, and a lot of legal scholars agree with us on this, is that even requiring a detailed description of an algorithm could be an inconsistent policy with this particular rule in a trade agreement. And that could generate huge problems that we can explain later. As Lori mentioned, industry's objective is to include these terms in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, and they talk about them as high standards for digital trade. But only 11 on almost 200 digital trade and e-commerce terms that are included in trade agreements have this kind of very extreme provisions. So that shows how problematic this is. Finally, next slide, please. Actually, two more. Another one. Thanks. Finally, I just wanted to show this slide because I think that it's very important, that shows all of the different policies that will be undercut at the federal and state and the local level and in different areas, including Senator Markey's facial recognition and moratorium bill, if these kind of rules become the global standard. So the stakes are very high. It's very important for people to understand this and to start paying attention to these digital trade negotiations that could undercut AI regulation, both here in the United States and abroad. And back to you, Lori.
Daniel, thank you very much. And one, I think, really important contextual note we can take from that is how industry hopes to get the algorithm secrecy rules slipped into the Indo-Pacific Agreement to basically normalize what is an extreme, fluky, anomalous provision and make it seem like it's something that should be the general rule. And thus the stakes are high. And now to hear from folks who are real experts on AI and digital governance, I'd like to invite Sarah Myers-West to speak. Sarah is the managing director of AI Now, and she just left the FTC, where she served as senior advisor on AI. I commend everyone to go to AI Now's website and look at their 2023 landscape paper, which is a tour de force generally on AI oversight, but also has a terrific chapter on the collision between the digital trade agenda of the industry and proper oversight. Sarah has over a decade of experience with critical examination and writing on the political economy of the tech industry. And as a PhD researcher, has brought an enormous amount of information to policymakers and outside scholars and organizations alike. And we're very fortunate to have her here. Sarah, please.
Thank you so much, Lori and Danielle. I really commend you on the new report. It's really fantastic and very badly needed work. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that those who are interested in tech accountability, I think really need to be paying very close attention to that are foregrounded in the report. As Lori and Daniel have both mentioned, digital trade is really quickly emerging as the next battleground where trade rules could function to either prematurely deter or entirely undercut ongoing regulatory conversations about data privacy, algorithmic accountability, and competition in the tech industry, efforts that are very sorely needed at the present moment. AI is already in widespread use. It's being used to shape people's life chances and their access to resources. And the risks and harms of these technologies are very much a pressing concern in the here and now, which is what's prompting regulators' swift movement toward action. For example, accountability research has provided critical insights into things such as the racial biases in the use of predictive policing and criminal justice technologies, which have led to the over-policing of communities of color. Such research has also surfaced a discrimination in the algorithmic systems used to structure access to credit, to housing and healthcare. And regulators concerned about these harmful impacts are poised to intervene, potentially by including stronger mandates for auditing, testing, and validation to ensure that these systems don't cause widespread harm, as well as whether they just front and center work as they're intended. But while there's significant political momentum behind regulations at the federal and state level at a number of different fronts, including data privacy, competition in digital markets, and algorithmic accountability and safety, this momentum could be entirely foreclosed by any trade agreements that would work to further entrench and expand the privileges that the tech industry enjoys. And this could prematurely cut off the opportunity to make interventions designed to work in the broad public interest. So as we all know, international trade law impacts how products and services are regulated, including digital services, and not following these trade rules could have real punitive consequences. Countries who do so can be sued, they can have sanctions imposed until non-conforming domestic policies are removed or changed. And so what brings us here today is, the very real concern that some of the trade policies currently under consideration could directly impact the scope to do this kind of fairness and accountability work that thus far has been absolutely critical to surfacing the very near-term harms associated with AI technologies. And this report, I think, does an excellent job of illustrating the stakes here. In particular, it calls out that one of the key goals of the digital trade agenda is imposing rules that would thwart governments from being able to proactively monitor, investigate, review, or screen AI and algorithms by forbidding access to the source code and perhaps even very detailed descriptions of the algorithms. And this is really key to, everything that we know about what's otherwise a fairly opaque technological domain. This would have a profound impact on future avenues for policymaking, and it could foreclose measures such as the creation of requirements that company systems be audited for accuracy, including proposals that I think Senator Markey will be describing shortly. The effect of this would be to place the tech industry essentially above regulatory oversight at the very same moment it is engaged in pushing products out into widespread commercial use with significant downstream effects on the public and with very little adequate scrutiny. There's a growing movement demanding that algorithmic transparency and accountability be placed front and center in the tech policy agenda. And so it's critical that US and other countries' trade policies be responsive to that call and not allow industry to foreclose even the possibility of scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarah Myers-West. And now to cross the Atlantic, please welcome Dr. Kristina Irion. She's Associate Professor at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam. She's also the director of the annual IVIR Summer Course on Privacy Law and Policy and the coordinator, as well as a lecturer, in the Master's Information Law program. She's a non-resident fellow at the Center for Media, Data, and Society at the Central European University in Budapest, where she had been, until recently, an associate professor at the School of Public Policy. She's done landmark research on the connection. She will explain what is the proper verb between digital trade rules and AI and oversight and digital governance in general. Professor Irion, please.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you for having me in this super important webinar this afternoon. And I'm delighted that I can comment a little bit on your research. I think the report that you have published today, Undermining AI Regulation in the US and Abroad, is doing a tremendous job in breaking down something that is extremely complex and where I sometimes find it difficult to convey why it matters for our future regulation, for our future societies, that we are very cautious about giving too much protection for source code secrecy in the context of regulation and public policy. And I think a good starting point is to explain that trade law originally has been there to remove tariffs and quotas at the border when services and goods are traded, and that it is also a useful instrument to protect against discriminatory treatment and to eradicate a few practices that are undisputably trade barriers, but it has recently developed into a new way of influencing regulation, like you rightly said earlier, Sarah, that has chilling effects, I would say, on the regulators to draw up new regulatory instruments. And one of these is the digital trade agenda that has a couple of favorite points for large tech companies, like the free flow of data, but also source code secrecy. And this clause has captured my attention. So I'm already doing research for the last 5 years on this clause. And I was actually super happy to see that now it also catches up this discussion in the US, because in the beginning, you sometimes feel a little lonely when you are seeing that something comes from the trade law field in. And while all attention is, especially in Europe, focused on policy making in the AI Act and in the Digital Services Act and in the DMA, we were so absorbed that we didn't see it coming, from a totally different policy venue, which is trade law. And as you may also already know, and the report says it nicely, trade policy is not made in the open. These are governments that are negotiating behind closed doors, and it is very, very difficult for the public to have a proper dialogue and a proper public debate about the appropriateness of such new clauses. Now, the source code clause is commonly justified with the need to protect companies' confidential and business critical information against something that is called forced technology transfer. That is something that happens in a very few countries and has been in observation from policymakers around the world. And one of the countries that is often named has been in the past China, but also a couple of other bodies are out there that are actually requiring access to proprietary information, and then they transfer this information to a company or business in their jurisdiction in order to allow them to exploit the information of others. So this is the reason that is mostly given why we need to protect source code of software now, especially, and also algorithms. But when I see then this new clause in the US-led trade agreements, but also what the EU is doing, then you realize that they are creating a prohibition to require access to source code of software for governments that will stifle regulation, oversight, and accountability, and that they forget about the transfer part. So in a way, this clause is justified to prevent forced technology transfer, but actually it is targeting lawmakers' efforts, regulatory efforts to create an accountable and transparent algorithmic society. Now, that having said that, we have to now look what it does, this clause. And I have been working closely on the EU policy field. And in the course of this, and has been mentioned earlier already, we are now in the final stages of adopting a major big legislation, the AI regulation in Europe. And this will have a couple of specific safeguards. One of them is that high-risk AI systems have to undergo pre-market conformity assessments. They have to have an audit, and if checks are needed, then regulatory authorities will have the ability to require access also to the source code and to audit this source code. Now, in the run-up of this new regulation, we saw already a number of industry statements coming in, especially from large US industry associations that was basically accusing the EU of committing forced technology transfer. Although the whole purpose of this regulation is not to give this innovation to somebody else, but actually to hold them accountable. So recently, I have then also required documents from the European Commission about the interface between AI regulation now in the making and trade law. And one of the things that came out of this access to document request was that the trade-related branch of the EU government has advised that the AI regulation should not require source code of software because of commitments they are currently negotiating in the field of digital trade. So we see that there is a direct link, and that actually, which is the most dangerous, before even the regulation is in the public disclosed in order to discuss, and the lawmakers are starting to also mull it over and fine-tune it to adopt it as a law. the regulation is already toned down in order to reciprocal commitments made under trade law, and that is dangerous. I would also like to mention that we are seeing a rather, let's say, a strong discourse now between the US and the EU emerging. Last month, there has been a letter by quite a large group of members of Congress to President Biden, asking President Biden to relieve technology companies from the US from being so overburdened with regulation in the EU, that the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Service Act are outrageous, but also that all of this is producing forced technology transfer. There we go again. Nobody forces a transfer on them, but you need for accountability and transparency to also look under the hood. I also would finally like to highlight that I believe that when such technologies affect the lives, livelihoods and communities, individuals, and sometimes whole populations, then this is no longer an exclusively private affair. This is something that needs to have some sort of public accountability. And also, just because it is a new development, a totally new revolution, the AI, we need to be vigilant and able to scrutinize it and observe carefully that it fits the purpose, that it doesn't harm, that it doesn't discriminate, and that we are exploiting the good elements of new technologies without actually amplifying negative developments in society. And with this, I want to give back to you, Lori. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Irion, very much. And for folks who want to read the story of her Freedom of Information Act discovery about how already a digital trade agreement has rolled back AI regulation, it's EurActiveTV.com, which is how trade agreements narrowed EU rules to access AI's source codes. So it is now my honor to introduce Senator Edward Markey. He is a champion of the public interest, whether the issue is climate change, clean energy, safeguarding privacy, preserving an open internet that spurs competition. Senator Markey has been fighting for people and the planet in Congress for decades. He served for 37 years in the House of Representatives, where I first met him in the 90s during the original debates over the World Trade Organization and NAFTA. He was first elected to the Senate in a special election in June 2013. And among all of the laudatory things one can say about Senator Markey, who has had leading climate change legislation and privacy legislation and AI oversight legislation and anti-nuclear proliferation leadership. He is a person who has one of the biggest brains in Congress and one of the biggest hearts in Washington. And so I am just so honored to be able to introduce him now to speak. And we just got a notice that his line dropped. So we'll wait for him to get back connected for 1 second, and I will then call him back on. May I please ask one of my colleagues who can text his staffer that's in the run of show. And while we are waiting for him to come on, let me just tell folks that we're going to have questions and answers after a question and answer period after we hear from Senator Markey. So if I may please ask everyone to use the chat function in YouTube to be asking questions. They will be fed to the panel. And we will hopefully get Senator Markey right back on in 1 second. But I can, and again, start queuing up your questions because the whole hot queue will be sent to us in one chunk so we can get through as many of them before we get to the end of the show. So post your questions now in the chat part of the YouTube chat box. While we're waiting for Senator Markey to get connected back on, let me answer or offer at least one of these questions for folks now to address. And that is that we hear he's going to be here in a few minutes. So let's do some Q&A first. And then they just had to shut down on the computer. So we'll give them a second to reboot, and we will do one of the questions. Well, we'll do two of the questions. How could companies enforce these rules to challenge regulation is question number one. And then could these secrecy rules bind or affect state and local rules? So I'm going to take a hit on the first question, which is there's always curiosity about the difference between what is binding versus what is enforceable legally. So binding in the trade agreements or in other agreements like the IPEF are rules that are shall, if it's a shall rule, versus if it's got Weasley language, like the parties recognize or the best practice should be, that stuff is hortatory. But if it says the parties shall, the signatories shall, that's a binding agreement. But then there's a question about, but how do you enforce that? And right now there's an open question because the chapter has not been tabled about whether the IPEF will have what kind of actual enforcement built in. Agreements like NAFTA and WTO have their own tribunals that, unlike all other areas of international law, can actually authorize sanctions. So NAFTA, WTO, binding and enforceable. The IPEF enforcement question with respect to internal provisions is an open question. However, the hitch is that some of these commercial rules probably could be enforced privately by the technology companies, even if IPEF does not have internal enforcement. And that is because existing agreements between the parties in the IPEF, such as between the US and Singapore and the US and Korea, where they're free trade agreements, have a mechanism called investor-state dispute settlement. It's a policy, a program that rather outrageously elevates individual companies to the level of a nation state to privately enforce a public treaty. So as between different countries, the existing investor-state enforcement mechanisms, and they are enforced between a bunch of the IPEF countries in agreements, many of which the US is not a party to, could be a mechanism where these commercial rules, through what is called a ratchet clause or a most favored nation, you can bring rules through investor state, and it's technical and crazy sounding. So we should do another webinar on that question, but there's a way to enforce these commercial rules, even if it's not internally enforceable. And with that, I will throw open for additional comment from anyone on that question. And also my 2 cents on state and local is typically these agreements are binding the whole way down. So unless there's an exclusion, they have scope provisions. So again, depends on the scope provisions, but typically it's not only the federal government, but the federal government ends up with an obligation in international law that is obliged to ensure conformity of the policies throughout the system. So there is my 2 cents, and I open it to anyone else to comment, please. Professor Irion, please.
Maybe briefly, I believe it has a great self-limiting effect or regulatory chilling effect in the jurisdiction itself. So a government, before adopting a new law, will run the draft against existing commitments and trade agreements. And if source code of software or algorithmic secrecy is protected, then it is already the first no-no. Yeah, and the whole legislative process will start being chilled and start being cautious if that is a way to go at all, or maybe alternative policy solutions should be implemented. So I think a lot of this is self-executing almost because governments are, of course, aware of their commitments. And I'm also warning especially against the effect of attributing source code of software and algorithms some sort of status of secrecy. As you may know, there are other legal regimes that are actually in charge of protecting this type of technology and innovation. So, for example, source code and can qualify for copyright protection, in some situations even patent protection. And if a company is extremely cautious about it, they can also invoke trade secret protection, which is very broad in the US anyway. And now layering up another special regime that protects source code against regulation and algorithm with it, then that would be not only like stapling protection mechanism on protection mechanism, but it would also outpace actually our ability as society to come to terms with algorithmic impacts that our societies will feel.
Very helpful. Thank you. Daniel?
I will just add something to the question regarding state and local law. And it is that we are seeing a lot of interesting activity in a lot of states, in California, in Idaho, that are putting forward certain legislation on facial recognition software, for instance, or even regulation on social media. And in a way, you could try to see if those kind of regulations could be excluded from the scope of the agreement. That's what is usually done with other kind of areas that are more well known. The issue with AI regulation is that we are just coming to terms with all of the different harms that these kind of technologies can have in our daily lives. So it's very hard to know what's the forthcoming regulation, and then establishing this kind of blanket prohibition on access to source code that doesn't let you do either a carve out to exclude certain policies or non-conforming measure. I'm getting very technical here, so that you can save existing regulation. I think that that's very concerning. And that's why people that are pushing for these kind of policies at the state and local level should also be concerned, because the policy space there is also being invaded.
Thank you very much. And now we hear that Senator Markey is being pulled towards the floor. So we may be getting him from the cloakroom from his phone. For folks who are not watching the congressional schedule, today and tomorrow are it until September, and they're trying to pass a huge bill. So we are going to let him perhaps walk to a quiet place and come back with us by phone. His staff is trying to get that achieved, and I'm going to raise some more questions. Number one, which is, what are some hashtags on social media we can direct people to for following this conversation as it develops further? And maybe Sarah from AI Now, who's a leader on this, you have some ideas. Senator Markey just texted to say he's on the way, so stand by, but let's start answering. Also, what is our best analogy for how outlandish the company's unwillingness to open up their algorithms for review is? Another question, should we consider AI companies' efforts to force the US government to implement provisions in trade deals regarding the source code as an example of regulatory capture? And then finally, what trade groups or individual companies are actively lobbying against source code and algorithmic transparency? And for that, I can offer a couple. For instance, the CCIA, which is a tech industry digital trade group, which has been saying that our current trade rules basically limit almost any kind of regulatory oversight of tech, which is not yet true, but would be if they were to get these kind of rules in other trade agreements, which, warning, preview of coming attraction, the trade associations and companies are also pushing to get this into the WTO. So IPEF has served the test run, but there's a big WTO push as well. And while we wait for Senator Markey to get to a quiet place, let me open up the floor to anyone else who wants to add.
I can take the regulatory capture question and point the person that asked the question to the research of a sociologist named Wendy Lee, who actually gave a case study of how digital trade is the best example of regulatory capture. And she explains through a lot of interviews that were done with both negotiators and also lobbyists, how the tech companies decided very deliberatively to go into the bloodstream of Washington, D.C., and insert this idea of digital trade as a way to move forward their agenda and cement the conditions that allow them to grow as big as they are right now and to do all of the things that they do right now into trade policy. And this happened after a negotiation on intellectual property showed them that these rules could be used for these purposes. So I just will direct that to the paper of Wendy Lee. And I think that the name of the paper is The Third Phase of Regulatory Capture. So I think that says it all.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And the senator staff, he said he is right there and they are getting him online. So I'm going to make an executive decision, and viewers, please, I hope, be happy about this, and everyone else forgive me at ACT TV. If we can please roll 5 minutes over so that the senator can join us. I beg everyone's indulgence and forgiveness. I think it will be worth our while to hear from Senator Markey. And there is Senator Markey. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator Markey. I gave you an incredibly laudatory and loving introduction, which I will send you by email. And I'm going to just introduce you and ask you to please join us. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Laurie. And I mean, I've been listening to Laurie, my whole life. What's the right thing to do? So I just so much respect you and everyone who is leading on this issue. Daniel, Sarah, Kristina, and thank you to Rethink Trade for the vital work you are doing to fight big tech's attempts to avoid scrutiny. There's a lot of natural excitement today about artificial intelligence. Everywhere you look, companies tout new algorithmic innovations, promising that artificial intelligence will revolutionize every industry from agriculture to financial services to the law. Congress has jumped on the AI hype train as well. AI experts roam the halls of Capitol Hill, running from one office to the next and leaving lobbyists wondering why they keep getting bumped from the schedule. So don't get me wrong, there's a promise in AI, but there are also undeniable pitfalls. This technology is impressive, but we've already seen how algorithms can impose serious harms, from biased facial recognition software to manipulative advertising directed towards kids to worker discrimination. And we need only watch the movie Oppenheimer to see the impacts of hubris in any race to introduce new products and innovation without planning for unintended consequences. I was watching NBC last night, and they had a big story about how San Francisco wants to be the AI capital of the world, filling all of their empty office spaces. Well, we're also going to have to fill in the spaces with ethics, with safety, with protections that are added to the technology. So the hype train is in full motion right now, and we just have to ensure that there is transparency, there's accountability in AI. We just can't become lulled by the promises of this technology while deliberately blinding ourselves to the risk. Congress must stand up to big tech's efforts against AI regulation, because we know that allowing big tech to regulate themselves is a road to abuse, to neglect, to discrimination, and to harm. And now that AI is touching on more and more aspects of our daily lives, regulators and the public has to know how these algorithms work, and we all must be sure that they are safe and fair. At the core of our efforts must be transparency and accountability. Unregulated algorithms are just too risky to be hidden in a black box. We must see what data is being used to train AI algorithms. We must understand what biases algorithms have, and we must know how AI algorithms have been tested. And that's why earlier this month, I reintroduced my Algorithmic Justice and Online Platform Transparency Act to prohibit harmful algorithms and increase transparency into websites' content, amplification, and moderation practices. This legislation is an important first step towards understanding and addressing the biases and other harms baked into AI-powered products and services. So passing this bill or any technology regulation won't be easy. Big tech is already bringing their high-priced lobbyists to Capitol Hill to warn against any regulation at all, to promise that this time, really, they are going to be very careful in implementing their new ideas. Don't think we're just going to try to maximize profits. Don't think that we're just going to do it just for our own self-interest. No, we care about everybody else as well. But if they fail to honor their promises, if Congress somehow or other comes together to impose new AI regulations, big tech won't just accept defeat. No way. No way. And Rethink Trade's great new report demonstrates corporate behemoths from big tobacco to big oil are experts at exploiting every single dark avenue to avoid regulation. And no avenue is darker than international trade deals, because for decades, corporations have turned to trade agreements negotiated behind closed doors with undue secrecy and hundreds of corporate lobbyists as a backdoor to undermine the public interest. And we've seen how corporate influence on trade deals can stymie progress at home and abroad. Just a few years ago in the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, Chevron and ExxonMobil were able to protect their ability to file suit in secret tribunals against climate and environmental policies. Big oil received giveaways, making it cheaper to export dirty tar sands oil through U.S. pipelines and blocked all climate and environmental standards in the deal. The good news is that President Biden and his U.S. trade representative are working to create a new worker-centered trade policy, but we're not going to be able to rest on our laurels. In politics, only the paranoid survive, and we just have to assume that they're going to be trying to do their worst, because that's just who they are. It's baked into the personality of these corporations. So as Congress turns its intelligence to artificial intelligence regulation, we can't lose sight of all of the arenas where big tech is vying for influence and attempting to undercut critical protections. The stakes are too high. We need to make digital space safe and ensure AI is managed in a way that benefits people, protects their rights and liberties, and doesn't threaten them. So this is a pivotal point in our history. And if we don't pay attention, they're going to run away with all the goodies and then make us try to catch up for a generation. And they'll argue, oh, how can Congress understand this? How can non-experts understand it? Oh, we understand it. We know what you're going to try to do with it. You're going to try to do with it what you did with every other product that the private sector has introduced into our society. I've been on the committee of jurisdiction over most of these industries for 47 years. The auto industry didn't want seat belts. They didn't want airbags. The tobacco industry didn't want regulation. The big Silicon Valley companies didn't want protections for children online. So for so many of them, if you kick them in the heart, you're going to break your toe. And all we have to do is just let them know we're ready to kick them in the heart, okay, over and over and over again until they feel it. So these are going to be huge issues, and we can't allow them to move any faster than the human values that we want to attach to the technologies will make it possible for them to move. So that's our challenge, and you guys are the national leaders. Thank you so much for everything that you are doing.
Thank you so much, Senator Markey, for your leadership, for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said in his introduction, one of the biggest brains in Congress and the biggest hearts in Washington, D.C. Very happy he's on our side, and we look forward to his bill getting passed, as well as other critical digital governance protections. And again, as the senator just said, there are few more secret, darker corners of deregulation and sneak attacks from corporate lobbyists than trade agreements and the international preemption of the policy space. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, thank you to the senator, to Dr. Irion, to Dr. West, to my colleague Daniel Rangel, who helped write the report. And please find his other reports in addition to this one at rethinktrade.org to dig into more. Let me thank all the folks at American Economic Liberties and the Rethink Trade staff who made this possible, and the folks at ACT TV for the production, and indulgence to all for rolling a little late. Aren't you glad you did, though? Wonderful to hear from the senator. What a rock star. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for all you're doing.